Frankie's alarm clock rattled against the nightstand at 3:30 in the morning, its shrill metallic buzz tearing through the quiet of his queen's apartment. He slapped it off with a heavy hand, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and sat at the edge of the bed, while the weight of another day settled on his shoulders. The city outside was still half asleep, but for Frankie, mornings began in the darkness. Pulled on his thick socks, laced his worn-out boots, and lit the first cigarette of the day. The smoke lingered in the air like a reminder of yesterday's shift, acrid, and familiar. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms wedged above a diner that smelled permanently of grease and burnt coffee. His wife, Mary, stirred in the bed behind him but didn't say anything. She was used to his schedule, used to the smell that clung to him no matter how many showers he took. His son, Danny, was curled up in the next room, probably dreaming of something cleaner, brighter than the world his father trudged through every morning. Frankie drained the last of the stale coffee from the pot, grabbed his thermos, and stepped out into the hall. The streets at that hour were quiet, in a way New York almost never was. A couple of cats darted between garbage cans, and somewhere, far off, a siren wailed faintly. Frankie walked toward the sanitation garage, hands shoved in his coat pockets, the air biting against his face. Every block carried the smell of refuse, as if the trash seeped into the bones of the borough. When he reached the garage, the yard was already alive with the growl of trucks and the clatter of men pulling on gloves. The garbage trucks stood in, lined like metal beasts waiting to be unleashed. Frankie nodded at his partner, Joey, a stocky Italian with a perpetual smirk that hid the bitterness in his eyes. Joey tossed him a half-hearted wave. The men didn't need long greetings. They lived in each other's pockets day after day, bonded by sweat and stink. They climbed into the truck, the cab smelling of diesel, sweat, and yesterday's spilled coffee. Frankie slid into the passenger seat and stared out as the truck rumbled. To life, the city rolled past, still half asleep, its neon lights flickering over empty streets. Trash waited for them everywhere, piled high on curbs, bags bursting open with the weight of what New Yorkers threw away. The first stop was in the Upper East Side. The streets were pristine, lined with brownstones that stood proud against the morning dark. Frankie heaved them into the truck, muscles already burning, and tried not to think about the hours still ahead. The doorman barely looked at him, turning away as if garbage men were invisible, was used to it. As the truck rolled downtown, the city shifted. The Lower East Side was another world. Here the bags were ripped open before the truck arrived. Rats bold enough to scatter only when the headlights bore down. Junkies leaned against stoops, eyes glazed, graffiti screaming from every wall. Frankie lifted a bag that oozed with spoiled food, and a needle pricked through the plastic, just missing his palm. He cursed and tossed it in. Joey laughed like it was nothing. Frankie knew that laugh. It was the same laugh he forced out when the weight of the job threatened to crush him. The work was relentless. Bag after bag, can after can, each heavier than the last. The stink clung to their clothes, soaked into their skin. Frankie's back ached, his hands raw inside his gloves. But the rhythm of the work carried him forward. The clang of metal cans against the truck, the hydraulic hiss as it swallowed the city's waste, became a drumbeat marking the hours. Frankie saw the city in a way most never did. Each neighborhood told a story in its garbage. The Upper East Side threw away steaks barely touched, wine bottles still holding sips of red. Downtown tenements piled up broken furniture, empty bottles, bags of rotting vegetables bought cheap and left to spoil. In Chinatown, the smells were stronger, fish and herbs clinging to the air. Frankie thought sometimes he could map the city's secrets just by what it discarded. But the job was more than just lifting bags. The union ran everything, and everyone knew the union was tied to men you didn't cross. Frankie paid his dues, but he'd heard the stories. Money disappeared. Contracts were fixed. Men who spoke too loudly found themselves out of work or worse. It was a strange kind of protection. Union fought for their benefits, their pensions, their sick days. At the same time, it kept them in line, a leash wrapped around their throats. Frankie kept his head down. He needed the job. His boy needed shoes, and the rent didn't pay itself. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. His muscles screamed with every lift. Joey kept talking about a guy he knew making easy money on the side, letting certain bags disappear, looking the other way when the mob wanted a quiet pickup. Frankie listened but didn't answer. He knew what Joey was hinting at. A few extra bucks could make life easier. But Frankie also knew what came with it. It's one bad move, one wrong word, and he'd be in deeper than he could crawl out. When his shift ended, Frankie trudged back to Queens, every step heavy. The bar in the corner pulled at him like it always did. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. Men hunched over their beers, voices low and tired. Frankie ordered one, then another, letting the bitterness wash away the taste of garbage that lingered in his throat. He didn't drink to get drunk, not always, but to blur the edges of a life that felt too sharp. Home wasn't easier. Mary hated the smell that followed him in, the stink that seemed permanent no matter how hard he scrubbed up when he dropped his boots by the door. Danny came running, though, smiling, arms around his waist before recoiling at the odor. Frankie's chest tightened every time, but he forced a smile. He told Danny stories about the city, stories that made the garbage truck sound like an adventure. He wanted his boy to see a hero, not a man who hauled trash one night. Frankie and Joey were working a block downtown when Joey froze. Frankie followed his gaze to a black bag half buried under the rest. Something about the shape was wrong, too rigid, too human. Joey pulled it back and the truth spilled out. A body, pale and lifeless, crammed into the trash like it was nothing. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city's noise seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their breathing. They called it in. But by the time the cops arrived, the union men were already there, telling them to keep working, to forget what. They saw. Frankie felt the weight of it pressing down. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but Joey pulled him back. The look in Joey's eyes was enough. This wasn't their fight. The garbage truck swallowed the rest of the bags, the body gone like it had never existed. That night, Frankie lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Mary slept beside him. He couldn't shake the image of the body, the lifeless eyes staring through the plastic. He wondered who it was, what story had ended in a pile of refuse. He wondered if anyone would ever know. City was a machine grinding up lives and spitting them out, and he was just another cog turning in the dark. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. Frankie kept working, kept lifting, kept sweating. The job wore him down piece by piece. His back hurt constantly, his hands calloused and scarred. The pay was steady, but the bills never stopped coming. Mary's patience thinned, arguments sparked. Over money, over the time he spent at the bar, over the smell that clung to everything he touched. Frankie wanted to tell her about the body, about the union, about the weight crushing him. But the words stuck in his throat. Still, there were moments that kept him going. A little girl waving from a window as he passed. An old woman who pressed a candy into his hand with a whispered thank you. Without him, without men like him, the city would drown in its own waste. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. Frankie sat on the curb one evening, the shift finally done, his body aching. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling into the twilight. The city moved around him, alive and relentless, thought. About the men who didn't last, the ones broken by the job, by the union, by the streets. He thought about his boy, about the life he wanted to give him. The city chewed men up, but Frankie kept standing, so that was all he could do. The winter of 1983 came down on New York like a hammer. Snow turned to slush in hours, and the city smelled worse when the piles of garbage froze and thawed in endless cycles. Frankie's truck slogged through streets where plows barely reached. Tires crunching over ice, exhaust spilling into the bitter air. Work didn't stop just because the weather punished them. If anything, it got worse. Bags tore open easier when they were frozen, heavy with ice, and the rats grew bolder, desperate for scraps. Frankie's gloves were soaked before dawn most days, and by noon his fingers were numb, despite the constant movement. He didn't complain. Complaints didn't pay rent. He just pulled harder, lifted faster, and pushed through. Joey never stopped talking, a steady stream of curses at the cold. At the union? At the city itself? Frankie listened without saying much, letting the rhythm of Joey's voice fill the empty spaces between them. That was the way with garbage men. It's talking past the time, even if no one really cared what was said. The work was hard enough that silence made it worse. Joey told stories about women he never really dated, fights he never really won, and schemes he never really tried. Frankie half smiled and let it wash over him. At night, the bar was fuller than usual. Winter brought men in from the cold, each of them chasing warmth at the bottom of a glass. Frankie sat with a beer and stared at the television over the bar, where news anchors spoke of politics he didn't trust and wars he didn't understand. Around him, men argued about the mayor, about Reagan, about unions and taxes. Frankie kept quiet. He had no faith in any of them. Politicians didn't see men like him unless there was a strike or a scandal. Till then, he was just another back breaking under the weight of trash. Mary grew colder as the winter dragged on. She said Frankie's drinking was getting worse, that Danny deserved better than a father who spent his evenings staring at the bottom of a bottle. Frankie wanted to argue, to tell her about the body, about the threats whispered by the union, about the way the city leaned on him until he thought his spine would snap. But he couldn't. The words stuck, heavy and useless, and he just let. He took it all in and said little. Then came the strike. The city had cut budgets again, and the union pushed back. Trucks stopped rolling, garbage piled in mountains. Along the curbs, rats swarming in daylight, the smell choking entire blocks. Frankie walked the picket line with Joey, holding a sign he didn't believe in, watching the city rot without him. People screamed at them, called them lazy, called them thieves. Frankie held the sign higher and stared straight ahead. Inside, he wondered how long it would take before the city begged enough to cave. He knew one truth. New York could survive without politicians, without bankers, without lawyers. But it couldn't survive long without garbage men. After weeks of standoff, the deal came through. The trucks rolled again, and Frankie was back. At it, working double shifts to clear the backlog. Bags rotted in the sun, juices leaking across sidewalks, maggots writhing inside. The smell was unbearable, even for men who thought they'd smelled everything. Frankie gagged behind his cigarette, eyes watering, but he kept lifting. The city cursed them while thanking them in the same breath, unable to hide its dependence. One night after a long shift, Frankie walked into the bar and found Joey deep in conversation with a man Frankie didn't recognize. The man was well-dressed, hair slicked back, gold chain glinting under the light. Frankie knew the type. Mob, Joey waved him over with too much enthusiasm. Frankie sat, listened, and quickly realized what Joey was doing. The man wanted them to look the other way on certain pickups, to let certain bags vanish without questions. Easy money, Joey said, grinning like a fool. Frankie's stomach turned. He excused himself early, left Joey at the table, walked home in silence. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling again. The temptation was there, sharp and bitter. The paycheck was steady, but steady never felt like enough. Danny's shoes wore out faster than he could replace them. The bills stacked up higher every month, and Mary's eyes carried a weariness that cut deeper than any insult. Easy money could make life smoother, but Frankie knew better. Easy money was never easy. Men who took it found themselves dragged deeper until there was no climbing out. He decided right there he'd rather break his back honestly than sell it cheaply. The city didn't get better. The crack epidemic spread like fire through the boroughs, and Frankie saw the aftermath in the trash. Empty vials glittered on sidewalks, broken glass cutting through bags, needles tucked in corners of cans. He and Joey cursed when they cut themselves, wrapping filthy rags around bleeding hands and hoping for the best. Hospitals cost money, and garbage men didn't run to doctors unless they were dying. They patched themselves up and kept going, carrying the weight of a city collapsing under its own addictions. One afternoon, Frankie came home to find Mary packing a bag. Her eyes were red, her voice flat. She said she couldn't keep living with the smell, with the drinking, with the silence that hung between them. Danny clung to her leg, confused and scared. Frankie stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. He wanted to beg her to stay, to promise change, but the words caught in his throat. She left that night, taking Danny with her to her sisters in Brooklyn. The apartment was silent, empty in a way the city never was. Frankie sat in the dark with a cigarette burning down to ash and felt the weight of everything pressing in. The next morning, he still went to work. The bags were heavier than ever, the stink sharper, but Frankie lifted all the same. Joey noticed the quiet, asked once what was wrong, then didn't ask again. Men like them didn't talk about feelings. They carried them like they carried trash, heavy and unspoken. Months dragged on. Frankie visited Danny when he could, brought him little gifts from the street. Things thrown away but still good. A toy car missing a wheel, a baseball glove worn thin but usable. Danny smiled, and for a moment Frankie felt whole again. But when the visits ended, the silence returned. One rainy night. Frankie's truck turned a corner in the Bronx and nearly ran over a man lying in the street. They stopped, dragged him to the curb, and realized he was barely alive. A junkie, gaunt and shaking, his pockets stuffed with empty vials. Frankie wanted to call an ambulance, but Joey shook his head. He said it wasn't worth the trouble. Man was already dead on his feet. Frankie looked at him, rain pouring down, the city rushing past without a glance, and felt a hollow ache in his chest. He knew Joey was probably right. The man didn't make it through the night. By morning, sanitation had swept the street clean, as if he'd never been there at all. Frankie started drinking more after that. The bar stool became his second home, the bartender, his only confidant, about the city, about the trash, about the things he'd seen, and the bartender would nod without comment. Replaced by the same silence, despite everything, Frankie kept showing up. Through storms, through strikes, through heartbreak, he pulled on his boots, climbed into the truck, and lifted bag after bag. The city leaned on him without thanks, without recognition, but he kept it alive. Without him, New York would drown in its own filth. He told himself that was enough, even when it didn't feel like it. The summer of 1984 hit the city like a furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the pavement, the stench of garbage baking in the sun. Bags swelled and burst, meat and milk and bread turning sour in hours. Flies swarmed in black clouds, and Frankie waved them off with his arm as he heaved bags into the truck. Sweat ran down his back, soaked his shirt until it clung like a second skin. The air was thick enough to choke, and still the work never slowed. Joey cursed more than usual, wiping his forehead with filthy rags and spitting into the gutter. Frankie kept quiet, conserving energy. The heat pressed down on him like an anvil, each block stretching longer than the last. Some mornings, by the time they reached the Bronx, he felt ready to collapse. But he never did. He told himself he couldn't. The city depended on men like him, even if it pretended not to. The neighborhoods told the story of the summer, too. In the Upper East Side, air conditioners hummed behind closed windows, garbage filled with empty beer bottles and expensive takeout containers. Downtown, kids ran through busted fire hydrants, their laughter clashing with the shouts of dealers. On the corners, in Queens, where Frankie lived alone now, stoops filled with families fanning themselves against the heat, watching the world with tired eyes. The city was alive, restless, and Frankie moved through it like a ghost, lifting, hauling, sweating, disappearing again into the rumble of the truck. Mary let him see Danny every other weekend. Frankie would take him to Shea Stadium or Coney Island when he could afford it, trying to give the boy something better than the smell of trash that followed him everywhere. Danny loved the rides, the cotton candy, the roar of the crowd at a Mets game. For those few hours, Frankie felt like he was giving his son the world. But when the day ended and Danny went back to Brooklyn, Frankie felt the hollow echo return. One night, Joey dragged Frankie to a card game in the back of a bar. The room was thick with smoke, laughter too loud, money stacked on the table. Frankie didn't belong there, but Joey insisted. He lost $20 in 10 minutes, and the men around the table watched him with eyes that were too sharp to knowing. Frankie left early, heart pounding. The mob had its hands in everything. Joey stayed, grinning, pockets lighter by the time he stumbled out hours later. Frankie shook his head. Joey was always chasing trouble. The trouble came soon after. One morning, Frankie showed up at the garage and Joey wasn't there. No one said much, but Frankie heard the whispers. Joey had taken money to let certain pickups vanish, and now he was gone. Some said he skipped town, others that he'd been found floating in the river. Frankie didn't ask, didn't want to know. He just climbed into the truck alone and started his route. Working solo was worse. Every bag felt twice as heavy, every block twice as long. His back screamed in protest. His knees buckled under the strain, but he kept moving. The foreman promised him a new partner soon, but weeks passed with no one filling Joey's seat. Frankie didn't complain. Complaints only drew attention. He lifted, sweated, and swallowed the silence. One afternoon, on a street in Harlem, Frankie heard shouting. A woman screamed from a window, waving her arms frantically. First he thought it was just another domestic fight, but then smoke curled out of the building. A fire was climbing fast, flames licking the brick. Frankie dropped the bag in his hands and ran inside without thinking. The stairwell was thick with smoke, heat pressing down like a wall. He found the woman on the second floor, clutching a little boy, eyes wide with terror. Frankie grabbed the boy, shouted for her to follow, and barreled down the stairs. The smoke seared his lungs, his eyes watered, but he kept moving until they burst onto the street. The crowd cheered. Firefighters. Arriving seconds later, the woman sobbed thanks, clutching her son. Frankie coughed until his chest hurt, his skin streaked with soot, but he waved them off and climbed back into the truck. He finished his route that day, silent as ever. The newspapers didn't mention his name. The city didn't know who carried the boy out, who risked his lungs in the smoke. Frankie didn't expect them to. Heroics didn't fit the uniform of a garbage man. He lit a cigarette that night and stared out the window of his apartment, wondering how much more the city could take from him before nothing was left. Years blurred together. Frankie's hair thinned, his back bent, his hands gnarled from years of lifting. Mary never came back, though sometimes she looked at him softer when he came to see Danny. The boy grew taller, his hair hiring the same weariness Frankie saw in the mirror. He told his father he wanted to be a teacher, not a garbage man. Frankie nodded and told him to chase it. Deep down he felt relief. He didn't want his son to inherit the streets, the stink, the silence. He wanted him clean, safe, far from the truck. By the late 80s, Frankie had a new partner named Luis, younger, faster, full of jokes that made the work feel lighter. Luis talked about music, about dreams of moving to California, about a world outside New York. Frankie listened, smiling at the way Luis carried hope like it was armor. He remembered being young once, before the city wore it out of him, he hoped. Luis would make it out, but the city had a way of keeping people chained. Luis got in trouble with the wrong crowd. Missed shifts, came in with bruises. Frankie pulled him aside, told him to be careful, but Luis just laughed it off. Then one morning, he didn't show. Just like Joey before him, gone without explanation. Frankie didn't ask questions. He'd learned by then some answers only hurt. Alone again, Frankie shouldered the work. He was older now, slower, but he refused to quit. The pension was still years away, and quitting meant losing everything. The city changed around him, skyscrapers rising, neighborhoods gentrifying, but the garbage never stopped. New York always had waste, and men like Frankie were always there to carry it. The winter after Luis disappeared came in gray and slow, snow that turned to dirty piles at the curb, wind that cut through layers of clothing and filled the lungs with cold that burned. Frankie moved a little slower now, felt the tightness in his hips when he stepped off the truck, the bite in his lower back when he lifted a bag that had soaked up a week of rain. The new foreman said they were short-staffed and nodded toward the street like the city itself would forgive the shortage if the route was finished. Frankie did not argue. He pulled on his gloves and got to work. He had learned the trick long. Oh, go, do not think about the mountain. Think about the next bag. Lift, swing, toss, step, breathe. The rhythm soaked into his bones until he could feel the weight of the truck as if it were part of him. The engine idled with a sound he could feel under his feet. The hopper sighed as it crushed another load. The city breathed in and out, and he moved with it, another muscle in a body too big to name. He ate at the diner downstairs more often now. Mary had called from Brooklyn to say Danny had a school project about the city. Would he be willing to talk to the class about what sanitation workers did? Frankie said yes right away, then hung up and stared at the wall with a feeling he could not name. Pride? Maybe fear too? He had spent his life being invisible. Now he would have to explain himself to children who did not know what a day on. The truck felt like he could already see their noses wrinkle. On the day of the talk, he put on his cleanest shirt and a jacket that still smelled faintly of soap, and he took the train to Brooklyn. The classroom was bright, the walls covered in drawings of bridges and buildings, the skyline in crayons. The teacher introduced him, and 20 faces turned toward him with open curiosity. Frankie cleared his throat and began. He told them the city threw away everything, and that everything told a story. He described the careful way you had to reach into a can in winter so you did not get sliced by a frozen tin lid, the way you. He saw their eyes widen and kept going. He told them about the time a bag moved and a cat shot out like a firework, and the children laughed so loud the teacher had to quiet them. Told them the truth he had come to believe. That the city would fall apart without the people who cleaned it. That the trucks and the men who rode them were like blood and arteries and veins. The kids started to look at him differently. Danny sat in the front with his hands folded on the desk, face shining with something that made Frankie feel taller than he had felt in years. When it was over, the teacher thanked him and the class clapped. And Frankie thought that might have been the first time in his life a crowd had applauded for him. On the train ride home, he kept one hand on the seat and watched the stations go by. The faces in the window were the same as always, but the world felt slightly shifted, like a picture that had been straightened. The next months were cruel. A storm tore across the city and dropped so much snow that side streets disappeared. Trucks chained their tires and crawled along like old animals. People pushed cans into the drifts and expected miracles. A man yelled at Frankie for missing a bag buried in a bank of snow as tall as a child. Frankie wanted to ask the man if he had ever tried to lift 50 pounds of frozen waste, while the wind turned his face raw. Instead, he lifted the bag and tossed it in and moved on. He was lifting a soaked bag behind a restaurant when he felt the pain tear across his back like a hot wire. He dropped the bag and leaned both hands on his knees, breath gone, eyes watering. His partner that week, a quiet man named Sal, stepped in and finished the lift without a word, and swallowed it down. He knew the rules. The city did not stop, and if you showed weakness, the route did not care. That night he lay on his mattress with a heating pad, tucked under his spine, and listened to the radiator pop. He thought about Joey and Luis and the way men fell off the map in this city. He thought about the boy in Harlem he had carried through smoke and how no one had ever said his name. He did not feel angry. He felt something closer to acceptance. A man made a bargain when he chose this work. He took the weight and asked that his family eat. He asked that the rent come paid. He asked that the city keep turning. By spring his back loosened enough to move without cursing. He walked a little hunched now and took steps like a man who had measured every staircase in Queens. He started to skip the bar when he could. The drink had not fixed anything, and it made Mary's voice colder on the phone. He brewed coffee at home and stared at the window while the sun climbed slow over the rooftops. Sometimes he would see a kid on the sidewalk with a stick, batting a crushed soda can up the block, and the sound would take him back to his own childhood. When the city felt endless and hard and full of games, he still thought about the body. It would arrive in his mind at odd hours like a door that opened onto darkness. He would try to puzzle out who it had been and how a life could be stuffed into plastic and left on a curb. The thinking never led anywhere. The city had taken the answer and packed it away. He learned to let the door swing shut. The city changed and did not change. Graffiti faded and was replaced by ads. Some blocks got cleaner, others did not. Money poured into parts of Manhattan, and the trash in those blocks turned lighter and stranger. Frankie lifted bundles of boutique cardboard and bags filled with glossy paper and bubble wrap. In other neighborhoods, he still found the bones of old couches and the smell of food gone bad. The trucks aged. The men changed. The work stayed the same. Years slipped by. Danny finished high school and started at a city college. He worked part-time at a bookstore and said he might want to teach. Frankie listened with quiet joy and never once suggested a safer choice. He would hand his pay to a world that gave. His son a desk and a chalkboard and a room that smelled of paper instead of rot. On Sundays, if he was not on a shift, he would take the train to Brooklyn and sit with Danny on a park bench. They would talk about baseball or classes or the Mets or the subway line that always ran slow. And Frankie would watch his boy's hands move as he talked, quick and sure. As if he were already writing on the air. Then came the injury that stayed. It happened in late summer, on a day so hot the tar looked soft. He lifted a can that felt like it had a dead fridge inside, and something in his back let go with a crack he felt, rather than heard. The pain bloomed in a way that stole his breath. He tried to keep moving, but his legs would not listen, and the world wobbled. The foreman sent him to the clinic, and the doctor pressed along his spine and said words he did not like. Degeneration, compression. Rest was not a gift in his world. Rest meant no shifts. Rest meant no overtime. Rest meant the landlord knocking at the first of the month with a look that did not care what your doctor said. He went back to the truck before he should have and ignored his body's protests. Shortened his stride. He bent from the knees. He learned to read a bag by the way it sagged. He worked smarter, not harder, he told himself. Even if smarter still meant pain, one night after a long shift, he climbed the stairs to his apartment and found Mary sitting on the landing. She looked small under the hallway light. She said Danny had got a call from a counselor at school. It was a program that would send him to student teach in another state for a semester. He did not hesitate. He thought of the card games in the back of bars and easy money that sucked men under. He thought of the union and the way it smothered questions. He thought of his back and the truck and the boy in the classroom who had looked at him like a giant. He said yes. He went to the bank the next morning and signed for a small loan, and the clerk did not look up when he slid the papers back across the counter. He put the cash into Mary's hand that afternoon. She did not hug him. She said thank you, and he nodded. And after she left, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor and felt a quiet happiness push against the ache in his spine. The last winter he worked arrived early. The air felt thin and sharp. Trucks coughed to life with effort. The men moved like people who knew what cold could do. Frankie wore 2 pairs of socks and a scarf that had belonged to his father. On a morning in December, a woman stepped out of a doorway and handed him a paper cup of coffee with steam lifting into the air. She said thank you without any other words. He took the cup and felt the heat ease the numb in his fingers. For the rest of the morning, the smell of the coffee mixed with the diesel and the city stink and made something almost pleasant. He poured the last swallow onto the curb and watched the steam curl. Pensions and years of service, and how many more winters? A man could stand. The older guys spoke in numbers. 2 more years, 3 more summers, 1 more contract. Frankie did not talk much, but he did his counting in private. He could make it to the number that meant he would not be hungry. He could keep the truck's rhythm in his bones a little longer. The day before New Year that year brought a storm with a cruel wind. Frankie and a young partner he barely knew were clearing a block in Queens when they heard a sound that made them both stop. It was a dog, thin and shaking, trapped behind a toppled fence with its collar tangled in wire. The animal thrashed and then went still, eyes rolling white. The young partner said leave it, and Frankie heard the fear in his voice. He climbed over the fence and reached for the collar. The dog snapped once out of panic, and then went limp in his hands as he worked the wire free, lifted the animal and set it down on the sidewalk. It wobbled and then leaned into his leg as if it had recognized something in him. Scratched its neck and looked around, but no door opened. No voice called out. He felt the young partner watching and knew what he was thinking. Only a man who had hauled the city's pain for years would pause in that cold to free a creature that could not thank him with words. They finished the route, and the dog followed for half a block before it vanished between parked cars. That night, Frankie dreamed of the boy in Harlem again. Only this time the boy had the eyes of the dog, and when Frankie carried him through the smoke, the weight felt like the weight of his own heart. He woke before dawn and lay there in the dark and listened to the city hum through the walls. He reached his number late the next year. The paperwork was stamped. The foreman shook his hand. A couple of men clapped him on the back, and someone brought a cake that tasted like cardboard and sugar. He did not make a speech. He stood in the corner with a plastic fork and a paper plate and thought about the first time he had climbed into a truck, how the seat had felt too big and the world too large. Now the truck felt like a jacket he had worn so long he could not remember the day he put it on. On his last day, the city gave him a route with streets he knew by heart. He moved slow on purpose, let himself see what he had learned to ignore. A woman watering a plant in a window that faced a brick wall. A kid in a red hat dragging a sled over patchy snow. A man in a suit stepping around a puddle without looking at the person sleeping beside it. He lifted each bag with care and fed it to the truck and listened to the machine crush it into something smaller. He took his lunch on a stoop and ate an egg sandwich from the diner and watched the traffic move like a slow river. When the shift ended, he wiped his hands on a rag and stood for a long time with his palm against the side of the truck. The metal was cool. He felt the vibrations through the skin of his hand. Vibrations he had known for so many years that he could tell by them if the engine was happy or tired. He thought of Joey and Luis and Sal and all the names that had passed through and away. He thought of Mary and the years of silence and the years of truce. He thought of Danny in the classroom and the applause and the future that waited in some school he could not picture. He took his hand away and nodded to the truck like a man saying goodbye to a horse that had carried him farther than he had any right to go. Retirement did not feel like a parade. The first morning without the alarm felt wrong, like missing a step on a staircase you know too well. He made coffee and sat by the window while the city woke. He walked to the corner and watched a truck rumble past with two men on the back who did not look up. He felt the ghost of the engine under his feet and the ghost of the weight in his shoulders. He went back upstairs and stood in the shower until the water ran cold. Days settled into a new rhythm. He went to the library and read the paper. Walked in the park and sat on benches warmed by the sun. He learned the names of birds from a paperback book that smelled like dust. He cooked simple food and called Mary to ask about Danny, and sometimes she stayed on the line longer than she used to. He told himself he would avoid the bar, and he mostly did. When he passed it at twilight, he felt the old gravity tug, but he kept his steps steady. One afternoon, Danny came to visit with a stack of papers. He said he was applying for a job at a school and needed to write something about the people who had shaped him. He asked if he could read what he had so far. Danny read a page about growing up in a city that was always loud, about a father who came home smelling of work, about a lesson that the most important jobs are sometimes the ones people do not see. He wrote that his father had taught him that dignity is not what you wear or where you stand, but how you carry weight when no one is watching. Frankie listened without moving. When Danny finished, the room felt very quiet. He cleared his throat and said it was good, and Danny smiled in a way that made the years fall off both their faces that night. Frankie went for a walk along a street he had cleaned 1,000 times. The air smelled like rain. Soldiers waiting for a truck that would come at dawn. He touched one lid with his fingers and thought about the way the city had once lived in his hands. He felt no bitterness. He felt tired and grateful all at once. Word of a new strike bubbled up later that year. Younger men carried signs and shouted. At cameras, Frankie watched on television with a feeling like watching his reflection in a younger mirror. He wanted to tell them to keep their backs straight and their eyes open. He wanted to tell them to hold each other up and to laugh when they could. He wanted to tell them that the city would curse them and then beg them and then forget them, that none of that could decide who they were. He turned off the television and stood at the window instead, listening to the far hum of a truck. Time did its quiet work. His back hurt in a steady way now, but the pain felt like a companion rather than an enemy. He found small rituals. He bought apples from a cart on the corner. He fixed a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet. He learned that a pot of water and a handful of tea leaves could make a morning feel kind. He kept his work boots under the bed, not because he needed them, but because their shape in the dark felt like a truth he could hold. On a summer evening, he took the train to Brooklyn to watch Danny stand in a school auditorium and accept a job that would start in the fall. There were plastic chairs and a microphone that hissed, and parents with cameras that flashed bright. When Danny shook hands with the principal, he turned toward the crowd for a second, as if searching for someone, and the moment felt clean and complete. Frankie walked home through the early night, and the city looked softer than usual. Windows glowed, a saxophone floated out of a basement, a couple argued in low voices and then laughed. A cat crossed his path with the slow confidence of an animal that owns the block. He reached his building and climbed the stairs and paused at the landing where Mary had once sat with a question in her eyes. He stood there and let the memory pass over him like a warm wind. Before bed, he cleaned out a drawer, filled with old union cards and folded maps and grease-stained receipts. At the bottom, he found a photograph from years ago. The truck behind him, blue sky above, his face younger and thinner, a cigarette hooked at the corner of his mouth. He stared at the man in the picture for a long time, did not feel sorry. For him, he felt something like respect. That man had done what needed doing. He had carried weight others had not wanted to carry. He had kept a city alive, and even if it never knew his name, it had breathed because of him. He put the photograph back in the drawer and turned off the light, building the distant pulse of the city that had been his companion for as long as he could remember. He lay on his back and breathed slow and steady. His hands rested on his chest, scarred and knotted, and he felt a deep calm spread from them to the rest of him. Morning arrived without an alarm. The sky was pale and the air cool. He brewed coffee and carried the cup to the window, the men on the back hanging on with one hand and pointing with the other. Frankie watched them disappear around the corner and felt no urge to follow. He stood there and drank and let the city move on without him. He spent that day doing small things. He wrote a letter to Danny, not because he needed to say anything urgent, but because he wanted to put words on paper where they would last. He told him he was proud. He told him to stand up straight. He told him to be kind to tired people. He told him that every job has a part that no one sees, and that those parts are where a person finds out who he is. He folded the letter and put it in an envelope and propped it against the salt shaker so he would not forget to mail it. In the afternoon, he walked to the river. The water was gray and heavy, and the wind pushed old papers along the path. He leaned on the railing and watched a barge slide by with a slow grace. He felt the familiar ache in his back and welcomed it like an old friend. A child ran past with a kite that bounced and tugged, and the child laughed at the way the strings sang. The sun dropped behind the buildings, and the lights came on one by one. The city did what it always did, made noise and light and mess, and it pulled people toward it and pushed them away. Frankie turned for home, his steps even, his breath easy. He slept early that night. In his dream, he was on a street that did not end. The cans were lined up, and the lids were tight, and the bags were tied well. The truck moved at a steady pace. He lifted and tossed, and the work felt light. Stood ahead and waved him on, grinning. And Luis leaned on a hydrant and called out a joke he could not hear but felt in his chest. The sun was warm. A window opened and someone said, "Thank you," in a voice he knew by heart. He woke with a smile he could not remember putting on. When morning came again, he dressed and walked to the corner to buy a paper. The man at the cart nodded and handed him the familiar folded stack. The headline was about something loud and far away. He tucked the paper under his arm and stood for a moment, listening. A truck turned onto the avenue with a rumble that sounded like a heart. The men on the back were young and strong. One of them looked up and caught Frankie's eye and gave a small salute. Frankie raised 2 fingers in return.
Why?
And Frankie stood on the sidewalk with the day in his hands and felt peace settle in like a soft coat. He turned toward home. He passed a can that had tipped and a bag that had torn and a scatter of orange peels on the concrete. He bent without thinking and gathered the peels and tucked them back into the bag and set the can upright. He felt the old rhythm come back for an instant, and then he let it go. He walked up the steps to his door and opened it and stepped inside, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that he had done his part, that he had held up his corner of the night while the city slept. He set the paper on the table, and for the first time in a long time, he sat without pain and without hurry, and listened to the sound of nothing at all, the sound a man hears when he has earned his rest.